It's great to be with Hussein Rashid here in New York, who's a self-described proud New Yorker and Muslim. Thanks for joining us today. Hussein, you have a fascinating background in academia, your work at undergraduate work at Columbia University and with Harvard Divinity School. How does that background in theology help you to talk about commonalities among faith communities, especially when you're in the interfaith space?
To me, it's not just my education, but it's my life experience. I grew up in Queens, New York, Rego Park, Elmhurst, and Forest Hills. And for people outside of New York, you may not realize, but Forest Hills was, and to a certain extent still is, one of the most diverse Jewish communities outside of Israel. And so I had friends who were, I bought my comic books from an Iranian Jew. My favorite restaurant was run by a Bukharan Jew. My best friend growing up was an Ashkenazi Jew, an Eastern European Jew. And our concerts we went to were Sephardic Jews, the Middle Eastern Jews who were running this music. So that was sort of the environment that helped me appreciate that you could have these different interpretations of a religion, you could have these different ethnicities of a religion, but when it came time to pray, you all prayed together. And that to me really helped me understand my Islam. And when I think back, how formative that was in understanding that sort of living together in difference. And so when I went on to the theological degree, for me it was saying, I need to understand how other faith traditions manage difference, but also bring it back into my own tradition, because it was there, right? We couldn't all go on Hajj if we didn't all see eye to eye on something. And so for me, it's how do we make that a lived reality in America? So it is that life experience, and it's that academic experience, and it's the community of people I work with across faith traditions and within Muslim traditions that I think allow me to see that spread and allow me to think, well, what does it mean to be religiously Muslim and loyally American? And I don't see those in conflict, but how do I articulate that to people who do see that as being in conflict?
Can you tell me a little bit about your research into the representation of Muslims and the self-representations of Muslims in America that you're doing?
Yeah, as you said, my research is about the representation and self-representation of Muslims in American popular culture. I'm really interested in, policy describes Muslims as one way, and then popular culture, where people are really learning about Islam and Muslims, describes Muslims another way. And Muslims are part of the American landscape, so how do we define our own definitions? And I started with looking at music and looking at Muslim artists in hip-hop, in jazz, in electronica, and seeing how they were trying to understand their religious identity through artistic creation and how they saw themselves fitting in the American landscape. Then now I'm looking at blogosphere, Blogistan as I call it, the American Muslim blogging community, and how these bloggers are attempting to create a Muslim community, a Muslim American community as well, by both educating non-Muslims and educating Muslims themselves about what it means to be American and religious at the same time.
As Associate Editor for Religion Dispatches, I'd love for you to share with us a little bit about the website, what kind of content exists there, and what people might find when they come to explore it a bit.
Religion Dispatches, it's a project I'm very, very proud to be associated with, is a project that launched several years ago as a way to talk about religion in America and American culture. Part of the reason I was drawn to it is I believe that America is one of the most religious countries in the developed world, but at the same time we have one of the worst vocabularies to talk about religion, because the two things you can't talk about in polite company are politics and religion, and those seem to be the two things that really seem to define everything in this country. Right. So for me, for Religion Dispatches to offer me the opportunity to say, let's build that vocabulary, let's talk more intelligently about religion. So it allows me to combine my academic hat and my activist hat quite nicely, I think. It lets me say, okay, this is what it means to be a Muslim as an academic, and this is why I think that the way we talk about Muslims or Islam in America is a problem, and that sort of bridges that academic activist line for me. My activist voice appears in other places, but Religion Dispatches gives me that happy medium.
Since 9/11, it seems as though the Muslim American community has perhaps been asked to define their own faith identity a little bit more. Do you think that's consistent or accurate in terms of what's been going on over the last decade?
I think that after September 11th, Muslims across the board are being forced to be representatives in their faith that people of other traditions are not. My example is, if you stop a Catholic on the street and ask them to explain the concept of the Trinity, you're probably not going to get a definitive answer. But every time you stop a Muslim on the street, they're expected to know 1,400 years of history, theology, law, current political events, and I think that's problematic. The two places that I felt most comfortable traveling after September 11th were the two places that were hit directly by the attacks, New York City and Washington, D.C. And I think it's because both of these cities have large Muslim populations. People recognize these Muslim populations. recognized that Muslims were victims during those attacks and continue to be victims after those attacks. And I don't think that when New York and Washington moved forward, the way we moved forward was to say, we are New Yorkers or we are Washingtonians and we'll build up from there. I think the rest of the country had a hard time with that because of knowing a Muslim, because it was a threat that, are we next? And I think that a lot of the healing that we did, the rest of the country couldn't relate to. But I think one of the things that has come out of it from the Muslim American community that has been positive is that amongst second-generation immigrants and third-generation immigrants, a lot of the divisions that kept our parents' generation apart have really been erased. Not that we don't hold on to our identities, but we want to do better work. So it doesn't matter if you're Sunni or Shia, whether you're Arab or South Asian or African American, that there is a project of making an American Islam that we are very much actively engaged with. And that work has gained more prominence. And I think people are now starting to realize that the joke used to be the imam, the priest, and the rabbi walk into a bar. And the funny part was not the imam walking into the bar, but that the imam would be with the priest and the rabbi. And, but I think there's the idea that the imam is not necessarily the same as the priest and the rabbi. We're now getting seminaries like Hartford Seminary, Zaytuna College, Yale is interested in this space, Claremont Theological Seminary is interested in this space, in creating the American imam, who is essentially an academic like a priest and a rabbi. But really the better partner is not necessarily the imam, but is the academic like myself who does theology, who can sit with the priest and the rabbi and have those conversations. And I think we're seeing that acknowledgement in the American society as well.
Hussein, I'm sure we could spend a great deal of time together, but I'd like to close out our time today by asking you how your specific faith tradition really informs your work and how you feel your work is really going to impact the next generation.
When I think about my religious tradition, I look at the Quran like any scripture as being full of ambiguities, contradictions, and tensions within itself. And to me, being religious is being comfortable in those tensions and creating something out of that. And I look to the Quran as that sort of source of that ambiguity. I look at the prophetic role model as a way to say this is how the prophet lived with these ambiguities and know that there's a moral message. And I look to the guidance of my imams. I'm Shia, the guidance of the imams, the descendants of the prophets, to say this is what it means to lead the moral and ethical life and to build that better community. And for me, the ultimate goal is to build a better and more just society, not only for my children, but for everybody's children.